Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of August, and today I'm going to be doing a full front update. Sorry if there's any audio issues. It'll take me a few days to fix all of that up before I get my permanent setup, but for now, I hope this is good enough. Let's begin by looking at Novoselivkse, where the Russians really were assaulting it very hard about a month ago, and since then the battles have really fizzled out, but now we're seeing an uptick in activity on the front line around this area. The Russians, they are sending their assault units and they're being aided by armored vehicles and tanks as they cross over the rail line and begin attacking the town of Novoselivkse itself, which does indicate that the town was in a gray zone or was even under partial Ukrainian control for that entire time. And this is a very similar phenomenon that we're seeing in many other towns along the front line, like in Staromaiorske, Klishivka, in towns like Pyatikatki even, where neither side really wants to get firm control over certain areas because they're in very disadvantageous positions, and so they're fortified on nearby positions, but they're not actually entering the town itself until they secure some of the areas around it. So now, in regards to Novoselivske, although the Russians have advanced a couple of blocks into the town, you could say, taking over a couple of remnants of houses, this has come at a very big cost, and their main push is still going on to the south. Their main push is going on around these forest plantations over here. You could see that generally the direction is towards Staromaiorske in the southern flank of Novoselivske in order to gain positions overlooking, first of all, Novoselivske, but also the Ukrainian positions in this valley, which stretches from Brest-to-Bate to Staromaiorske. And so the Russians, they sent in their tanks. There was an assault with 4 tanks very recently, and the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, they were able to destroy one of them, a T-80, and this was recorded on video. They were using drones, I believe, and in a different instance, you had the 92nd Brigade, which has some of its units in Bakhmut, while others are defending in Novoselivske. They were also able to destroy 2 tanks. So that's just the cost of these forward assaults, and so the fighting in that sector continues. But going to the south, we're going to look at the bridgehead around the Zherebets River for a second. In that area, really the fighting has turned into something more positional, so it's not really aimed at major breakthroughs anymore because it's going to be difficult for the Russians, for instance, to break through the Ukrainian lines now because the Ukrainians have fortified a lot of the lines over here, sending in reinforcements, building up defenses around towns they were able to fully control and retake from the Russians, like Libove. And then on the Ukrainian side, they're not really going to be able to advance here in any sort of rapid succession either because the Russians, they have so many forces that they poured into this crossing of the river in assaults. And really one of the main units involved in that would be the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade. And that unit is currently holding the line and preventing further Ukrainian advances. And that is the unit that is also giving the Russians artillery cover and preventing the Ukrainians from really trying to advance deeper into a place like Serebryansky. The Ukrainians, they are sending in mobile infantry groups without support from any sort of infantry fighting vehicle. It's just on land, small forces, and they are being covered by Ukrainian artillery, which is stationed on these high ground heights, this ridge that I talked about that the Russians wanted to secure. And now that's how the Ukrainians are trying to cover their advance in this area. But so far, it is still positional in nature. Again, around the Serebryansky Forest, not much has changed, but there is a minor update. The Ukrainians have been able to advance to the east, entering the western outskirts of Dibrova. They've not reached it yet, but they were able to advance at most 1,000 meters in that direction, which means they were able to retake certain dugouts and strong points in the Serebryansky Forest for the Russians. So there is a back and forth going on over here, and this will put pressure onto a key Russian forward position, which is Dibrova. Meanwhile, the Russians, they do continue their offensive activities to the south of Dibrova and Kuzhminye. This is something that's been going on for a couple of weeks now. I can't really say any specific advances because really the nature of the fighting over here into such a dense forest is that it's hard to tell exactly where the lines are. But generally, this map is reflective of the situation, and it's important to clarify that the Russians are attempting to continue their advances in this area, so they're in this offensive mindset. Now, moving to the south to Bilohorivka, This is an interesting situation because we haven't heard much from the town in a very long time, actually. So Bilohorivka, this has been under Ukrainian control for a while now. They counterattacked after the Russians took over Lysychansk and took over the entirety of Luhansk Oblast, and the Ukrainians were able to retake Bilohorivka and use it as its forward position to prevent Russia from approaching the town of Siversk. This is sort of this forward defensive node on the Siversk front, which needs to be taken out before a Russian assault towards Siversk could really be viable from any standpoint. And so the Russians are trying to improve their situation on the battlefield in order to give them positions that could be used to later on assault Bilohorivka. The Russians perhaps advanced from this hedgerow over here to the new line, so again, about 1,000 meters at most. And the Ukrainians have been forced to withdraw to the outskirts into the houses itself, not to the hedgerows around it. And so they're being really enveloped from multiple different sides, but the Ukrainians do still hold on to this position. They do still have a firm control over Bilohorivka. I should actually say that it's under Ukrainian control, not really Russian control. Technically, if you consider the water filtration plant as a part of Bilohorivka, then you could say that the town is contested. But in terms of every single house and every single street block within this town, it is fully under Ukrainian control. The Russians are approaching it though. They're closing in from multiple different positions. The ones that are most notable are, of course, as we said before, from this filtration plant, and then also from these hedgerows to the northeast, and also then directly from the north. Those are the three main axes, and the Russians are advancing in those three directions at a very, very slow pace. Again, it is mainly positional fighting at the moment, but it is meant for a future operation that will allow them to secure the town in its entirety. Just here as an example, here's the elevation map. You can see that the Russians are looking to secure these heights that are to the east of Bilohorivka, and they do have control of some of them already. And so that will give them a good opportunity to fire onto the valley in Bilohorivka itself, which you can see over here, where the Ukrainians are located. A very minor update on the Avdiivka front. The Russians were able to advance from the south of the town a bit to the south, maybe 400 meters, adjacent to this local reservoir. The reservoir I'm referring to is this one over here. The Russians made very localized advances over here, nothing significant. And on the axis around the city of Donetsk itself, the Russians advanced to the east of Opitny and really did approach the mine shaft in that area, which is this local stronghold under Ukrainian control, which gives them these very, very important forward positions that allow them to really get a full scope of the front line of all these fields where the fighting is going on. So it's a very important position for Ukraine to hold to the south of Avdiivka. The Russians have advanced perhaps one field, this field over here, advanced 400, 500 meters in that direction, taking over this stronghold. It will be a very long and methodical process because it's so fortified, and because we're not really talking about that many men assaulting it. It's in the like dozens in terms of the amount of troops that are probably involved in actually advancing through these fields to reach the mine shaft itself. And so it could take a very long time to clear it out and for the artillery to work and to successfully force the Ukrainian defenders out. But that's generally the Russian intention with that. Then the Ukrainians, they have been able to push to the east of Novoselivkse. Novoselivkse is an important Ukrainian defensive node, which they've been able to keep control over despite numerous Russian assaults. And now, really, the Russians haven't been focusing on pushing them out of it for a while, but the Ukrainians have been able to really reduce the pressure on it due to the fact that now they've advanced, maybe you could say, 200, 300 meters to the east through some of these open fields. And I'm going to be adding in a gray zone, but you could say the gray zone has expanded as the Russians have withdrawn from some of their forward positions that are near the town itself. And now you could say that there's about a 1 kilometer gap in between the Russian and Ukrainian lines. Again, relieves some of the pressure onto this town, which is also used as a forward position to fire artillery onto the city of Donetsk. Now, around the Vuhledar sector, the Ukrainians are actively attacking towards the town of Mykilske. So they are the ones that are attempting to break through right now. Before it was the Russians who were attempting to try to flank Vuhledar. Now the Ukrainians are trying to shape the battlefield in a way where they can eventually enter Mykilske and force the Russians out of their positions that are pretty close to Vuhledar, like Mykilske, as I said before, and Bilohorivka, town over here. And so what the Ukrainians did was they didn't take back that much land. It's not anything that significant. They really just consolidate control over some of the fields to the east of Vuhledar. So like an area over here and an area over here. That's really the areas that they solidified control over and were able to send men and vehicles through in order to in the future assault Mykilske. But Mykilske is still under full Russian control, and a lot of the fields in between Vuhledar and Mykilske are not controlled by either side. They are in a gray zone as depicted by the map. But what is good about what the Ukrainians did is that a lot of the fields they do now have control over in between these two blue lines are on this local ridge, which overlooks the Ukrainian positions in this valley, or sorry, the Russian positions in this valley in Mykilske that extends even further to Pavlivka. So the Ukrainians do have the elevation advantage in this sector. Around Staromaiorske, there is still pretty heavy fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian sides, respectively, with the Ukrainians really preparing for another push with their forces that were responsible for the advances around Mykilske and then Staromaiorske. Units that are going to be involved in particular include 35th Marine Brigade and the 128th Dnipro City Defense Brigade. These are the two main ones that will be pushing this spearhead, and that effort will probably be looking at towns south of Staromaiorske and also at taking over Putne. I talked about this on Twitter and in previous videos. The goal would be to basically push out the Russians from their positions on these higher elevated areas that are to the east of Putne and also to the north of it. And this would give Ukraine a local control over the valley, which would give them more favorable positions to push towards Staromaiorske. So for now, the Ukrainians are just building up around Mykilske specifically, and the Russians are trying to prevent this by firing their artillery onto the Ukrainian rear. And finally, around the town of Robotyne, the Ukrainians are now actually assaulting the town from the north directly, which is something that they avoided doing in their quote-unquote main thrust about a week ago. And that advance was done by infantry units through these two hedgerows that you see over here. That assault was unsuccessful and did not take over the town itself because you had units from the 810th Marine Brigade of the Russian Federation that were able to push it back. And just remember that the area directly to the north of Robotyne is pretty well fortified, so it is hard to break through that area. But perhaps the Ukrainians were thinking that because they were assaulting so much on the east, that some resources were diverted away from the north, and that may have been the rationale behind that. Either way, most of the assaults have died down, and we described this in other videos. But the general idea is that now the main assault units involved in attacking Robotyne, such as the 47th Mechanized Brigade and the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, are now in rotation. They're being replenished, being given additional supplies and manpower in order to launch additional assaults in the future. And you also have units that are not even connected to these ones, such as 116th and 117th, that are being moved in now. They're moving in their howitzers, their self-propelled howitzers as well, these batteries, artillery batteries, to the front line, to areas like Orikhiv, to Malotokmachka, and they're consolidating all of their equipment and forces to coordinate another assault in the future. That's being done with multiple different Ukrainian brigades that didn't see that much fighting in the last round of assaults through Robotyne. And so now they'll be moved in order to continue reinforcing the ones that did actually sustain casualties in those original attacks. And those are being moved into the Orikhiv area and its various suburbs. Now, the final thing I want to talk about before I end the video is about this Ukrainian strike on a Russian vessel. And so what happened was that around midnight of August 4th, a Ukrainian unmanned surface vehicle attacked a Russian naval base in Novorossiysk. And we'll zoom in on that right here. This is Novorossiysk, and there's the port that was targeted. And in that attack, a landing ship of Project 775, which is a class of Russian landing ships. Landing ships, by the way, they're usually used to transport cargo. So in this specific case, the vessel that was damaged is called the Olenigorsky Gornyak, and it was damaged by one of those unmanned surface vehicles. But according to the Russian MOD, they said there were two, and they claimed that both of them were repelled. But this goes against everything that we saw from the drone itself that recorded it being crashed into the vessel, and also from satellite imagery and just from videos on the ground of people that were recording the situation. So the vessel wasn't totally destroyed. It definitely was tilted towards one side, and it had to be towed back by various other smaller vessels to the harbor. And this is where it's docked at right now. There's satellite imagery that you could click on to see for yourself what's going on over there. And the thing is, for the moment, the Novorossiysk harbor and port in general has been closed off. But again, this is just temporary, not for that long. It won't cause any major supply issues for the Russians because they have many other of these vessels, landing ships. And this one was one of the older ones, this one that was hit. So, because of its old age and due to the severe damage, there is a possibility that it will never be restored and will never be capable of the sort of operations that it was doing before. But then, in that case, there is also the possibility that the equipment, the scraps, the the sort of components in the top side of this vessel could be used. They could be taken out and be replaced in a different vessel that was damaged in previous strikes by the Ukrainians. Just as an example, there are various similar landing ships that were damaged in a strike on the Berdyansk port early in the war in March 24th, 2022. And maybe the spare parts from this one could be used to repair that one or those multiple vessels that were damaged in that specific strike. That's just a possibility. But what I find to be really crazy about the situation is that how did this vessel, this Ukrainian vessel, go undetected for so long? Now, there's always a possibility that it was not launched from Ukraine. Somehow it was launched from Crimea by some special forces unit or by partisans. I have no idea. But if it was launched from Ukraine, that would be a massive feat. Because look at the distances between Ukraine and the ports. It's basically 700 kilometers. So the vessel was able to go 700 kilometers undetected. And this is after the Russians terminated, or after the Russians refused to renew the grain deal. And so now they have a lot of their Black Sea Fleet assets closer to the Ukrainian coast. Despite all of that, the Ukrainian vessel was able to make it that far into the Russian sphere of influence, or its Russian sphere of control in the Black Sea, very close to their own border, close to their own ports that they're using to transport military equipment and civilian equipment, and was able to hit a Russian landing ship, something that's very important to their supply. So this doesn't destroy their supplies, but it does show what could be done in the future, and that is something the Russians have to definitely work on, because even after the Kerch Bridge strike that occurred a while back, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how this was an issue for Russia's security, that they were not able to detect an underwater surface vessel. They were not able to do that. And the Russians did set up certain defenses around the Kerch Bridge in the aftermath of that to prevent further drones from making it that far away. But perhaps they didn't do that around Novorossiysk because something very similar happened there a few weeks later. And that's just a lesson for the Russian MOD in that case. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.